Hello, welcome to the Fantastic Fiction at KGB reading series. Fantastic Fiction is a monthly speculative fiction reading series held on the third Wednesday of every month, hosted by Ellen Datlow and me, Matthew Kressel. We spotlight well-known and up-and-coming science fiction, fantasy, and horror authors, and admission is always free. We publish a monthly podcast and video so people who can't attend the in-person event can still enjoy the readings. If you'd like to support the series, you can donate at kgbfantasticfiction.org/support. Anyway, on to the show.
Happy August, everyone. How are you all doing tonight? All right. My name is Matt Kressel. I co-host this series, Fantastic Fiction at KGB, with Ellen Datlow. Our series is on the second Wednesday of every month, and it is always free. We never charge a cover. All we ask is that you buy a drink, hard or soft, and tip your bartender. Kelly is working hard to keep you hydrated, also working hard to answer the phone. So it doesn't interrupt the reading. Thank you, Kelly. Our series has been running, this series has been running since the late 90s. Ellen and I have been doing it since, I don't know, a long time. We don't like to add it all up. It's frightening. But we're really glad that everyone's been able to continue to come to the bar. Quick announcement. Our readings, our authors for upcoming months. Next month, September 13th, John Roundtree and Ben Percy. October 11th.
Josh Roundtree.
What did I wrote?
Say John.
Yeah, that's what I have here. Maybe I wrote it down wrong. Josh Roundtree, excuse me. Ben Percy. Robert Levy, October 11th, and David Levine. November 8th, Cadwell Turnbull and Victor Manibo. December 13th, Holly Black and S.O. Cooney. And January 10th, we have Alex Schaller and our favorite guest, TBA, thank you. All right. So, I'm excited about our guest tonight. So, Steve, do you have any books with you to sell?
I do.
Can we see some of them? So, our authors have books for sale. We used to have a bookseller, multiple booksellers come, but now our authors have to schlep them. We kill them. It's painful. We bury the bodies. Can I see what you have for sale?
Sure, I have this.
Chapbook?
What I'm going to read, yes, the chapbook from which I'm going to read.
Oh, it's beautiful little chapbook.
With very tiny print.
Plushow and the spinning.
Plushow, yes.
Plushow and the Spinning Man. This lovely little chapbook, and you can't see it from there, but it looks like an old daguerreotype with a suited man with a camera for a face. So it looks quite beautiful. And Claire has a number of books that I'm told is also for sale. Is that correct?
I mean, yeah, if you have cash or PayPal, but they're also just to show off. But these are for free, everyone, if you want them.
Free comics. Negocios Infernales. Thank you. So please, at the break, come up and buy a book or not buy a book. We are very open if you want to come up and speak to your authors here tonight. In between, right? After you could come up during the reading. It might get awkward. It's fine. Yes. So, our first reader tonight is going to be Steve Berman. Steve Berman is the Lambda Literary Award-winning editor of over 40 anthologies, including His Seed and Burly Tales. He's also author of the Andre Norton Award finalist Vintage and 4 short story collections, the most recent being Fit for Consumption. Most of his work is queer, speculative fiction, and horror. He resides in Western Massachusetts. Here's Steve Berman.
First off, thank you, all of you, for coming out here, and thank you, Matt and Ellen, for having me here. It's a little intimidating because I have many friends here, including someone who I haven't seen in 37 years. a high school dear friend, Jared Freeman. Yes. Yes, so I'm going to read from this little chapbook that I recently published. Iona Press. It's been going on since 2001. So, thank you. Lethe Press.
Maybe you should name the press.
Lethe Press. I said it, but sorry. Lethe Press. Yes. And so this chapbook is a bit of a murder mystery, kind of a ghost story, and a definite anti-hero. And I do not do accents well, so I'm not going to try. But this takes place in Trieste in the late 19th century. Unexpected rapping at his hotel room door startled Pluchot, making him spill hot coffee over the page with the photograph of a Grecian marble boy he was studying. The youth's crotch and legs were now sodden and stained. Pluchot cursed as he lifted his cup. At a second, more insistent knock, Pluchot jerked open the door and glared at the elderly man wearing livery, who clutched a slip of paper between his fingers. "A telegram for you, senor?" Pluchot reached to snatch it from the servant's grasp, but the man's deeply lined face grew pale as he retreated 2 steps. Pluchot glanced down at the sleeve of his dressing gown, darkened by the coffee, which dripped off his digits. "It's bad luck, senor. Draw spirits." The man pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and gave it and the telegram to Pluchot, especially this time of year. If the man meant to provoke curiosity with this remark, then his efforts failed. With a clean hand, Pluchot recovered a 1 centesimo coin and dropped it onto the servant's palm. "Will there be a reply?" The telegram note lacked the customary envelope. It read, "Raise 250, signed F." Thrift rather than wit was behind the brevity. Pluchot crumpled the paper and frowned, not at the moment. He would not lose another wager to his cousin Frederick. He would impress the estates tonight and prove that he could charm an exclusive brotherhood of inverts and pederasts into accepting him as a member. Late that afternoon, at the hotel's long mahogany bar, the estates gathered to celebrate a momentous Calicoles night. These men lit punch-brand cigars and raised glasses to toast the legacy of their patron saint, the scholar Winckelmann, on the occasion of 125th anniversary of his murder. Their oldest and professed leader, Tolga, a short, graying Montenegrin secretary, almost fell off the chair while reading a ponderous-sounding passage from the very book that Pluchot had paged through in his room earlier that day, and now could barely recall. As a student of the world, rather than the page, Pluchot found his hopes of retaining some clever insight about classical art that would impress the others had begun to fade. He nodded, as if concurring with the others, as he lifted a tumbler of Pelinkovac, a strong and bitter local vintage that the established estates insisted eager applicants must sample while they drank cognac. Ouidar, a poet from Lorraine with an inky mane, raised his glass. "I'm inspired. I offer a motto for this occasion. The man knots the boy's string entangles the man." The others rewarded him with a brief clap of hands. Pluchot's applause a moment too late, so the gesture might earn more attention than the man's nonsensical benediction. "Have you heard Pedashenka has been arrested again for seducing a cadet?" asked Fritzi, the Austrian scholar, who wore atop his head a plump academic beret, as if about to preside over a commencement. His mustache might have once belonged to a walrus. "I wonder if the man becomes aroused after hearing a trumpet." He puffed out his cheeks, inspiring laughter. "I noticed that the Duchess has a new footman," Tolga told them. "A young waiter, beef with a bit of a pompadour." Fritzy asked, "Is he larkish?" "I say 30 coins of the realm to whoever fucks the help," Udart winked. "First, of course." Pluchot wondered if the estates had a similar wager about the other provisional member present, an enthusiastic and clear-shaven blonde Belgian in a serge suit, who asked, "Has anyone seen the ghost?" "There's a ghost?" asked Pluchot. "It's only a matter of time before I do," the Englishman, a clerk at the British Museum, said with a sigh. "Arcangeli never fails to appear during my stay here. And the rest of us have never so much as a glimpse," Tolga said in a tone that presented disappointment rather than suspicion. "What did it look like?" Pluchot asked. "Yesterday morning, while looking through the ground glass screen of his camera, he saw something queer. A swirl, what he might think of as a bit of pale fog, rushing along the outskirts of the hotel." "Not as fetching as your cousin's models," said the Englishman before he blew his nose in the handkerchief, "and nowhere as smart as yours." Pluchot bristled. Frederick seemed enamored of the estates, though he refused to gossip about these men, and Pluchot had no preconceptions other than the normal prejudices to nationality, appearance, and attire. But none irked him like the Englishman, and that began with a rumpled waistcoat, a cravat arranged to hide a stain on his collar, and frayed threads along one cuff. The man had yet to drop a centissimo, and twice emptied another man's glass when he thought no one was watching. Pluchot anticipated his return to Naples, and confiding to his cousin how one of the esteemed Calicolis inverts had fallen onto hard times, likely the man had turned out his pockets at the demands of some adolescent blackmailer. Fritzy rested a hand on the Belgian's shoulder, his fingers almost touching the much younger man's jawbone. "Digby, you outdid yourself in nominating this one. I admit, Morris, I'm unfamiliar with your work, but it's only proper we have a sculptor among our sect this night, and one taught at the Académie Royale des Beaux-Arts. There is theory, and then there is execution." Pluchot scoffed. Sculptors belonged to the past. Its relief and tiresome poses could haunt museums and forgotten plazas, but it could not compare with photography that had eclipsed the old clumsy ways of capturing beauty. The Belgian asked, "Did Winkelmann ever succeed in seeing that infamous statue of Pan? The one where the god ruts with a she-goat?" First, Tolga chuckled, then shook his head. Born a cobbler's son, the master wouldn't dare go to explore the basement of the royal palace, let alone gawk at something considered so scandalous in its day. "I read that he would often kiss the lips of a statue. A faun, I think." The plummy scholar licked his lips beneath their whiskers a moment, as if tasting the dusty marble in question. "As if it were a catamite." "No, that was an Englishman," mentioned Woodar, as he scratched around his nose. "Who, Mad King George?" asked the clerk. Everyone laughed. Pluchot snorted. If Winkelmann were ever as smart as you all profess, he would have known the difference between a boy whose bottom is that of a goat and a boy whose bottom is ravished by an old goat. And Pluchot stood taller, ready to preen for the wittiest remarks so far, when he realized the men surrounding him had grown quiet. He did not understand how his jest could offend, but clearly it had. Tolga frowned. Wudar examined his ink-stained fingertips. Only the Belgian's eyes offered a glimmer of amusement. Pluchot realized that his chances of being invited back had grown slim, and he might very well lose the only wager that mattered, the one with his cousin. Pluchot would redeem himself during dinner through an act of generosity. He asked the hotel wine steward if the duchy had any champagne in its cellar, anticipating the man's regret and apology. The hostile tariff between Italy and France made it nearly impossible to find a bottle, even in a worldly city like Trieste. Being ever so provident, I brought a magnum bonum from my wine cellar. I can fetch it from my room, and with your attention, it can be chilled in time to serve with dinner. Pluchot pressed a lira into the servant's palm. Would you indulge me by having your youngest of the waitstaff pour for us? Senor, the one, he is clumsy. Then better instruct him. At the lift, waiting for the servant to open the gleaming brass cage door, Pluchot met the soft-spoken Belgian. Maurice Van Nant, if you have forgotten, he said, extending his arm, though it is always my hope to be memorable. Pluchot shook the man's hand, as do all artists. Pluchot expected Van Nant to have a strong grip, a trait only natural for a sculptor, but he might as well have been a lamprey at the fish market. I suppose we satisfied the rest. I pray never to have another sip of that herbal sewage they foisted on us, said Mars. What floor, signori? The operator asked. Both men answered 4. Yes, a poor choice in spirits, Pluchot said. I prefer beer. The 4th floor is good for spirits, the operator offered as he smoothed out the front of his uniform. I mean ghosts, signori. Guests tell me that they've seen them in the corridors. Pluchot took a pinch of snuff as the lift slowly ascended. Pluchot knew that the humbler classes reveled in superstitions and presentiments. In Naples, some families still buried children beneath gutter pipes, or wore amulets to ward off the evil eye, which Pluchot considered ridiculous, unless one referred to coveting, which he considered a most acceptable vice. I heard one ghost is a man who robbed a guest, not of the duchy, but a hotel in this very spot before they built all this. They caught him and hanged him. The operator jerked his neck, which disagreed with his brimless cap. Van Nant shook his head. I'm afraid you're wrong. Francesco Arcangeli was broken by the wheel of Catherine. He gestured coarsely with his hands as if to twist and snap his finger bones. Crushed, really. A horrible death. He noticed them staring at him. I have wide-reading tastes. The operator grimaced as he retrieved his hat. It's the reason we're here, Van Nant said. And when Pluchot offered no remark other than ghastly, the Belgian added, Arcangeli is the one who murdered Winkelmann over 100 years ago. When the lift steadied and the cage door pulled open, Pluchot leaned into the corridor. Not to worry, looks safe to me. Pluchot, I must admit, I admire your ignorance. At dinner, Pluchot found himself seated between poet and scholar. Across the table, Van Nant was similarly throttled between the officious secretary and clerk. Elbows rose and fell as the waitstaff set down plates of wurst and fragrant krauty and little ceramic pots containing crème or mustard. He gestured to the young waiter, who began to pour the champagne. Gentlemen, let us all agree that this will be tonight's most pleasant thing. Pluchot smirked as they laughed or brayed or tittered, truly the sounds of a well-fed menagerie. He added, of course, I mean this nectar with its lovely mousse rising and spilling over the tops of our glasses. The waiter is too broad-shouldered for my tastes. Tolga examined the bottle. Well done, Pluchot. I remember your cousin telling us of your effort. I have almost finished my treatise, Fritzy said. He had retained the ridiculous beret to the table, and both felt lining and brow beneath were fecund with perspiration. Pluchot scowled at the man for interrupting the much-deserved praise. His cousin had mentioned that Fritzy could converse in 7 languages. Tact was clearly not one of them. The Englishman breathed out a long sigh, or perhaps a groan. Finally. He dipped his sausage deep into the mustard before shoving it whole into his mouth. Digby, you'll choke, tutted Udar. Pluchot whispered to the young waiter not to refill the scholar's glass. Wiping at his forehead with one hand while leveling his fork with the other, as if it were a pointer, Fritzy said, For more than 6 years, I have been comprehensively studying art from the 5th and 4th century, before the Common Era. The task of measuring and cataloging the size of areolas. Pluchot uttered a low, What? Digby chuckled. In your native German, my friend, it's Warzenhof, the wart yard. I damn know well what The servers broke in, bearing bowls of a fragrant fish stew to the table. Brodetta, senor. Pluchot nodded with pleasure at how the young waiter anxiously cradled the precious bottle of champagne as if it were a fallen lover in his strong arms. Nipples, such marvelous ornamentation. Udar began squeezing all the rolls with the enthusiasm of a grandmother eager to pinch the cheeks of her littlest ones. A bare chest would be nude without them. And your findings, Van Nant asked Fritzy? The most pleasing size is never larger than the span of the eye. The poet sniffed at a roll dusted with flour taken from Pluchot's plate. A startled eye or a serene eye? Fritzy seemed ready for the question. Startled. The largest I found belonged to the mourner's son at the Stutz collection. Bigger than the monocle your Chamberlain wears, Digby. And the smallest? Who cares about the smallest? Glares, hush, Pluchot. Of a pubescent? Of course, said Tolga, while accepting the flame from the handsome waiter's lit match, which came perilously close to singeing the older man's finger. Fritzy furrowed his brow. The athletes on amphora often only have a trace of nipple. Wudar pretended to inspect the dregs of champagne in his glass. I am fascinated by your findings. Not only is there rhyme between areole and aureole, not only that, but in their meaning, I can't be the only one to imagine how the tawny and bister is just the Gnostic shade of man compared to the guild of the divine. He glanced at all their faces, expecting agreement, if not admiration. Some local beverage would have been more authentic than this fizz, Digby said, stifling a belch with the back of his thick hand. And yet, your glass is almost empty, Pluchot said with a frown. But if you are so dissatisfied, then spend a few centessimos. Yes, show us the brass, Digby. The scholar slurped his stew until the lower half of his face dripped as much as the high ground. You have been keeping them close to your chest. It is not Colicolis night without them, remarked Tolga. Pluchot watched the Englishman anxiously touch his collar and shirt buttons. Frederick had told Pluchot that the Englishman's real contribution to the estates was possession of the very gold and silver medallions Winckelmann wore the night he was murdered, gifts bestowed by the Empress Maria Theresa. They had, over the decades, made their way to the archives of the British Museum. Digby removed them for the annual occasion and would boast how none of the curators had any notion of most of the holdings packed in gossamer in crates or on dusty basement shelves. Digby pulled the handkerchief from his sleeve to wipe both hands thoroughly. Friends, I regret to admit that I could not bring Winckelmann's glories with me this year. You may imagine my shock and dismay last week when I learned old Blighty planned an upcoming exhibition of various honorary medals and state decorations. The risk. Tolga looked pained as he muttered, most distressing. Woodar shrugged. It's for the best. They're cursed. The older man huffed and groaned and piffled. Why do you say that? Asked Van Nant. The medallions tempted Arcangeli to violence. Nothing good could come from them. Woodar, you have been snorting pounce. Digby's face became ruddy. I've had them on my person innumerable times, and nothing untoward has ever happened to me. Perhaps, Woodard sniffled. You forget, back in 1875, Oscar Wilde toured your museum and asked to hold the medallions. He publicly mourned how they were not displayed around the neck of the Westmacott athlete. The poet rose and held out his empty glass. Surely that fine young fellow, he said in a terrible rendition of an Irish accent, deserves a medal for losing a limb in the war for moral sensibility. Digby pounded a fist on the table, startling the waitstaff, bringing in the next course. And what tragedy has befallen Wilde? The man is famous, the toast of the theater. Woodar grinned as if he had won a sizable amount at cards. He married a woman. As he took an unsteady bow, Woodard dropped his glass, which struck the table, and rolled off, shattering it against the floorboards. Digby glared at them all. Van Nant let loose a laugh and applauded, to which the Englishman growled out, Don't listen to that croaker. Gentlemen, we are here tonight to venerate rather than squabble, warned Tolga. And yet, to begin upon my person, I tire of it. Digby snapped his fingers twice, and the young waiter abandoned his task of picking up shards of glass to attend to Digby, who grabbed his arm to pull him closer. I am retiring to my room, Torello. You will bring me the usual postprandial fare. So, the daydream has a name. Udart almost quivered. Torello began whispering in the Englishman's ear, nothing pleasing from the man's expression. He sputtered, This treatment is intolerable. Am I a guest to be pinched from hunger? The waiter winced. Van Nant returned to Digby and rested a kind hand on his shoulder until it was shrugged aside. None to worry. I will make sure Torello brings something to your room. Woodart leaned closer to Blachot. And so the Belgian has become the bawd for his guarantor. Demitasse and cake do not sound like a euphemism for sodomy, muttered Pluchot. More like a dying man's last request. For a moment, Woodart sucked at his teeth. Everything, my friend, is a euphemism for sodomy. Thank you. Thank you. I will just say, when the Englishman turns up dead, gasp, and, the mystery, Pluchot thinks, Pluchot, of course, thinks that he can solve it. Pluchot is not the most brightest person there is. And the only reason he wants to solve it is because he thinks that it will endear him to the others, and thus he will win the bet with his cousin. So, thank you. They are $9 each. So.
Please buy them. Thank you very much. We will be returning with the next reader in about 10 minutes, so have a drink and enjoy. Everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. Hi there. We're about to start the second. Huh? No, it's all right. I can yell too. Ahem. Thank you. It looks better than it sounds, doesn't it? Ahem when you whatever. Sometimes I write it, like as a joke, but saying it aloud sounds really stupid.
That word ahem?
Yeah. But anyway, welcome back to the second half of Fantastic Fiction at KGB. Our next reader is C.S.E. Cooney, who is the world, also known as Claire, who is the World Fantasy Award-winning author of Bone Swans stories. Other books include, and they are for sale after the reading. Other books include The Twice Drowned Saint, Saint Death's Daughter, Dark Breakers, and Desdemona and the Deep. More hands. Forthcoming from Outland Entertainment is, Negocios Infernales. See, I can pronounce French, but not Spanish. Sorry. A TTRPG she co-designed with her husband, Carlos Hernandez, who's here with us. So please welcome Claire Cooney.
All right, I'm doing the thing where I read from a work in progress. And it will be from the sequel of Saint Death's Daughter, the big pink one. And from the beginning, but I will skip around a little, which will be hilarious. I'm doing a stopwatch. I don't want to go over, so. It will be, the working title is Saint Death's Herald. Not like Harold, but Herald. Chapter 1, The Ghost-Mounted Man. If the man were a house, the ghost who possessed him would be the black mold spreading through his foundations. There was no stopping it. There was no scrubbing it. There was just enduring it. Except he couldn't. Not anymore. Just kill me, Cratchit Strathmondon begged as he shoveled out the grave with his bare hands. I am killing you, the ghost of a radiant stones replied. I'm just doing it at my own pace. Now dig. Useless to plead with the ghost, it would only irritate him, so Cratchit prayed instead to Era Elur for the blessing of death. But the ghost, he knew, was a necromancer, a priest of death. In life, the ghost had known the god of death by another name, but that seemed to make no difference to Era Elur now. Apparently, she favored the ghost's prayers above his own. Certainly Cratchit himself had dealt death in his day, plenty of it. Before the ghost had entered him, melting his left eyeball out of his face and taking up residence in the empty socket, Cratchit had thought himself mighty, warrior giant and royal assassin, a ruthless killer in the prime of his life. But he had never worshipped death. It had been transactional, a straightforward matter. That made all the difference now, when the only god who could help him had bent her ear to another. Buck up, cried the ghost. Put your back into it. Dig harder. You'll root out this gallows meat for me right quick, or I swear I'll seize control of your body again. Don't like that, do you? He sneered at Cratchit's flinch. Last time you curled up like an aborted fetal pig for an hour. Well, let me tell you now, boyo, we don't have time for that. The ghost threatened, but nonetheless held back. Kept himself tucked inside Cratchit's eye socket. He was so certain that Cratchit would obey. Cratchit was too. He was well trained, having been the ghost's mount for months now. Or perhaps for eternity. Or maybe he'd been down in this grave since his birth, digging. Or maybe he was already dead, and that was why Era Elur wouldn't grant him death. It was one of those harsh, gray, late winter days. The relentless precipitation waffled between liquid and solid states, resulting in a gelid misery. Any bird or beast so fortunate as to not be possessed by the ghost of the necromancer of radiant stones was tucked away in bush or burrow, cabin or castle, trying to keep dry and warm. Heave-ho, boyo! Come on, work those burly biceps! Think I chose you for your brains? Pah! Saint Death would gag on the paltry mouthful. And 12 gods know it wasn't for your magic. An emptier, more lackluster, gods bereft sack of unmagical meat I never did lay eyes on. As the ghost complained, Cratchin heaved ho. And then, at last, the mud relinquished the meat. A sucking sound, and the cold corpse in his grip glopped a few inches out of the soup and into the diffuse winter light. Not enough, the ghost cried. Once more! Cratchin bent his head to his breast, trying to breathe. He was dizzy. He was always dizzy these days. Every breath pinched a deep place between his shoulder blades. Each freezing gust seized his sinuses, sealed his nostrils shut. His mouth and nose were blistered with sores. But none of this, or any of his multiple other hurts, was worse than the sensation in his empty left eye socket. The static shock of ever-present infection, the slow, corrosive spalling of invasion. Stop loitering! Do you think we have all the time in the world? The foe is closing in! From inside his skull, the ghost spurred his host body, sending a spike of disorienting pain straight into Cratchin's brain. With an agonized sound, half bellow, half groan, Cratchin pushed, pulled, hoisted, and hauled the cadaver out of its slickening grave in a gross parody of birth. Out of breath, he leaned chest first against the lip of the hole to rest. Another slurp from the mud, and his numb feet slipped out from beneath him. Cratchin thought, I would give the world. I would give my mother's life. I would cut the heart out of my brother's body if I could just lie back and make this grave my own. Clicked the ghost. Tongueless, toothless, he was nonetheless still capable of that irritating click. And then it happened. One moment, Cratchin was falling back into the mud. The next, he was out of the grave once more and kneeling over the corpse, knife in hand, the flesh of his arm already scored open. Bewildered tears welled in his eyes. They fell with his blood onto the body beneath him. Every time I take control, the ghost growled, it lights you up like a beacon. They see you clear as a signal fire in the darkest reaches of night. Think the foe won't tear you apart to get at me? You'd be wrong, and then you'd be dead. As he wept and bled over the corpse, Cratchin felt the upturned grave gaping at his back, frosty as Era Allure's freezing breath, hollow as her icicle breast. Thank her name, the corpse he just dug up must have only recently been buried, 2 or 3 days at most, for its flesh was blistered, but not ruptured. Small mercies. Its reek was foul enough. Everything stank. The corpse, the mud, Cratchin himself. His breath rattled in his throat. He stared at the rope still binding the corpse's wrists. Criminal, the rope's accused. So it doesn't matter, does it? He pleaded with Era Allure. What we are doing to the corpse? Crimes committed upon the dead criminals, no less, are not crimes at all. The dead will never know. Surely any criminal deserving of execution deserves worse, don't they? She did not answer. He did not think her silence meant agreement. At least praying, if it was praying, put his concentration on something other than vomiting at the stench. Not that he had anything left inside his stomach to vomit. His head spun as the ghost squirmed around inside of it, scanning the skies for enemies. I can feel their attention shifting. They're turning our way. Why isn't it catching? You're useless. Cut again. We need more blood. Cratchin's hand shook on the knife handle. He whimpered uselessly, please kill me. Saint Death's sake, you nincompoop! No! The ghost snapped. I'm going to squeeze every last minimum of use out of you before I move on to better accommodations. What else are you good for, scocky trash? I gave my life destroying your kind, and 12 gods know I'll dedicate my undeath to it. Now, cut me a good one and bleed on this corpse, or I'll cut you myself. Trembling, but obedient, Cratchin sawed into the soft crease of his elbow with the muddy, bloodied knife. The ghost droned out instructions that by this time Cratchit had memorized and could ignore. They had performed this ritual of resurrection dozens of times in the months since the ghost had first possessed him. Usually the dead thing they would find was considerably smaller and less human, a bird smeared to feathers in the dirt, an incomplete set of fox bones tangled in the roots of a tree, a pony that had broken a leg and was put down at the side of the road. The ghost had a sense about the dead. He could sniff out a pile of old bones from a mile away, across water, cached beneath a stone. For some days he had been excitedly spurring Cratchit through the bush of western Damarash, until, finally, late this afternoon, they had stumbled upon the crossroads marking the border between Damarash and Leech. The gallows were not visible from the road. Gallows Tree and its garden of shallow graves were tucked coyly behind a hill, but the ghost had ferreted them out in a matter of minutes. He had sniffed through Cratchit's nose all the way up to a patch of freshly disturbed earth, positively gleeful. Now here they were, the earth considerably more disturbed, the corpse exhumed, and Cratchit bleeding all over it. After a while, the ghost yelled, "That's enough!" Immediately, Cratchit dropped the knife. It clunked to the ground, clinking into the mud. Ghost and host body both watched as warm red blood dripped down onto the cadaver. The ghost hissed when a few drops fell onto the ropes instead of dead flesh. "Wasteful," he muttered. "Get out of my way, I'll do it." Then for the second time that day, it happened. Cratchit's vision grayed. He felt his mind, like a kitten in a burlap sack, being thrust down into the darkest recesses of himself as the ghost took over. As he sank, he felt the ghost, that chewing on charged metal presence, skitter out of his left eye socket, down the side of his neck onto his shoulder. Thence it slipped into the open wounds of his left arm, and the ghost began to swell. He was pushing himself, pushing his magic, or his substance, he had called it during one of his interminable lectures, into Cratchit's blood, mingling with it as it left his body and spattered on the corpse. Living blood, dead accident, the soul stuff of a necromancer, all to create the third of the three states, undeath. "Come on," the ghost muttered through Cratchit's lips. "Come on, spark! Spark my Ictenica before they find us." The process was taking too long. It always took too long, according to the ghost. Had Cratchit been blessed by any of the gods, by any magic whatsoever, the ghost was fond of saying, he might have bent that to his purpose. Had Cratchit been that rarest and most coveted kind of sorcerer, a necromancer, his blood would have been so charged with death magic, there was nothing the ghost might not have accomplished with his plenteous fluids. Alas, this magical lack had been the cause of constant monologuing during their months on the road. Nor did the ghost stint now. Irradiant Radithor Stones was a ghost of many words, and many of them were the same words, over and over again. He usually nattered on about one of three subjects: how he was the world's greatest necromancer, how he must complete his life's work in northernmost Skakmat, and how his foes would pay. How they would pay. Once he was at full strength again and able to catapult upon their heads the long-harbored and resentfully nursed fruits of his wrath. The foes he was referring to, Cratchit had learned over long months of wearisome repetition, were some kind of uncanny storm rack of disembodied souls that was pursuing the ghost with single-minded fury. At the very end of his life, Irradiant Stones had ripped those souls untimely from their living bodies and imprisoned them in a basalt sarcophagus. Over the last century, his ghost had been picking his captives off one by one and sucking them dry of their substance to feed his undeath. Now, the souls who had survived had escaped their stone prison, and they wanted revenge. For his part, Cratchit wished they would get on with it. Anything to stop the ghost droning so. In more than the century of my afterlife, I have had to contend with the shortcomings of my own kin, my own flesh and blood. Oh, I have suffered. How I have suffered. But in my innocence, I believed that vanity and vapidity, arrogance, laziness, underhandedness, treachery, and worst of all, the ghost spat, or would have spat had he been corporeal, ingratitude, were the worst that someone of my genius would be forced to endure. But then, boyo, I met your useless husk, and I realized I would endure it all over again if it came with a fraction of actual power. Now catch! The ghost growled at the blood-spattered corpse. Catch, damn you, duodecafold! Give me my ectenica! The next moment it did. Cratchit knew it did, because he heard the ghost hissing with pleasure through his own broken teeth. Somewhere, in that mix of mud, blood, icy rain, and clay-cold flesh, a blue spark. Then 2, then 20. And then the spark became a shimmering throughout. The corpse was glowing as with foxfire. That's right, there's my good ectenica. Go on, open your eyes now. The newly undead thing gummed open its eyes. These were not the worm-eaten remnants of the corpse's cold clay. No, these were the pure, radiant, blue-white beams of undeath, and they looked up with adoration and obeisance. The ghost clucked Cratchin's tongue. Oh, no, there's much too much of you. I need a lot of speedy little pieces. I need bugaboos, decoys, distractions. Up, fast as may be. My foes are almost upon me. You must lead them a merry chase. The corpse, no more corpse in truth, was fully ectenica now. The pale blue semi-sentient phosphorescence, like the flash of a moonstone by moonlight, listened attentively to the ghost's commands and obeyed. The cadaver liquefied itself. Not entirely, just enough to break itself apart into a dozen chunks. The ectenical skull parted along its sutures. The ectenical arms dislocated from the torso, then snapped into pieces at elbow and wrists. The ropes binding the wrists fell into the mud like discarded snakeskins. Thighs tore themselves from hips, lower legs from knees. All pieces began to lose their former semblance to body parts. The ectenica became ever more amorphous, malleable. It flashed and flickered, bounced and slithered. And then each ectenical blob began to hop away from the gravesite fast as rabbits fleeing a fox, earless, tailless, furless rabbits composed of corpse and ghost and man together. Off you go, my bugaboos, sang the ghost, rubbing his host body's hands together. Go ye, and keep my foes at bay. Cratchin found himself floating back to the surface of himself, somewhat regretfully. The dreary, deadening presence of the ghost receded back into his left eye socket. He couldn't tell if the stinging numbness that was still raking his body came from the freezing rain or was a reaction to the ghost's recent ascendancy. The parts of his body that he could still feel disgusted him. The rain that wanted to be snow was slicking down his filthy hair, plastering his ragged clothes to his clammy skin and turning his lips blue. His right eye kept wanting to droop closed, except that the ghost kept propping it back up. Get up, said the ghost disgustedly. He sounded weary, as he always did after performing an act of necromancy. Move, boyo, we've got to keep going. Forward, ahead to leech, while the enemy's distracted. The foes, they both knew, wouldn't be distracted for long. The foes didn't have bodies to feed or water or lay down to sleep. They're on to me, running out of time, muttered the ghost. Out of time, out of blood, out of body. Need a new one. Something with juice. Something I can really suck on. Plump me up, give me back my edge. Something that will last me till I finish my work up north, finish what I started. Cratchin wished him joy of his juicy new body, whoever it might be, so long as he, Cratchin, would finally get to die as he most ardently desired. No slumping now, we're too close. Heave-ho, boyo. A wave of gray closing over Cratchin's consciousness. As the ghost rose again, he piloted Cratchin's body, forcing him to turn back on gallows and grave and climb that terrible hill once more. Once the ghost had prodded him over the crest and sent him stumbling down the scree on the far side, he let Cratchin take his own reins again, more or less. Wheezing and off balance, he scrambled out of the ditch at the bottom of the hill and up onto the stony road. Along the road, at the bottom of the hill, was a ditch. Inside the ditch was a dead deer. The ghost-mounted man tripped over it, picked himself up, then pitched forward at a lurching run, making for the road. He didn't regard the deer at all. But the dead deer, opened eyes filled with swirling gray fog, and regarded Cratchit Strathmondon. She studied him carefully, marking him. His body was emaciated, his flesh cut in 100 places. Most of the cuts had knitted badly, swollen with pus and other rank fluids. His feet were bare. He was missing most of his toes and some of his fingers. His veins showed black against rosy flesh. He shimmered with fever, shivered with cold. When Cratchit vanished over the first hill of Leech, the deer picked herself up out of the ditch and began trotting after him on rotting legs. One of her 4 hooves was missing, but she didn't seem to heed that. She didn't heed the holes in her head either, or the foulness on her fur, or the worms in her belly. Her torso was completely stripped. Ribcage, red and exposed, entrails, long ago become a feast for scavenger birds, rodents, and the bloom of blowflies that grew upon her carcass. But she had no thought for that. Instead, she focused on Cratchit's retreating form with an intensity more befitting a predator than a ruminant, however undead that ruminant might be. "Grandpa Rad," murmured the deer in the voice of Miscellaneous Stone's necromancer. "Finally." I'm going to skip ahead a bit. I think I have time in my 25-minute allotment. We'll see what happens. Those are gone. So Miscellaneous, great-grandfather Radiant Stones' great-granddaughter, also a necromancer, very rare thing. She's been chasing him. She really wants to get him. He's been no end of evil to her. And she's chasing him with a buddy of hers. And she's inside the dead deer, and she's sort of piloting it from a few miles away. La 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 la. Oh, thank you. So I'm going to skip a bunch that I thought I wasn't going to skip, but I don't have time. So she's inside the deer. Just in time, the deer looked forward again and watched as a man came stumbling out onto the road from behind a yellow tower of flowering gorse. In her decomposing throat, a human voice whispered urgently, "There he is, darling. Attack." The deer knew her purpose and goal. There, that small ball of blue flame sitting in the left eye socket of the man's skull, like lightning, if lightning could hold its shape. It radiated malignity and spite. She would dig it out. She would hook it out with her antlers and expose it to the air, where, untethered, accidentless, it would unravel into motes that the doe her mother would trample under hoof. The deer gathered speed, lowered her head, and rammed. Just before she made impact, the man looked over his left shoulder. The blue fire in his left eye socket blazed. Then the deer's forehead collided with the man's lower back. Her skull splintered wetly, minutely at the impact. The man grunted. His large body crashed down like a wild almond tree in a storm and lay sprawled on the dirt of the road. He groaned like a trunk splitting. Turning his head, he pressed his right cheek into the stony ground. His left eye sparked like light off a hunter's arrowhead. The doe, trembling with victory, stood over his body. She grunted, snorted, sneezed. Rising up on her hind legs, she bore down with her forelegs, pinning him to the ground. A wettish splat as something in him gave. A rib, perhaps. She bent her head. The smoky, shadowy tip of one phantom antler dipped into the empty left eye socket and hooked out that ball of radiant blue infection, that undead parasite, and flung him far from his groaning host. The ghost was lucky. No, not lucky. Luck was for feckless youths with no more brains than that maggot-rotted deer his treacherous great-granddaughter was piloting like a puppeteer's drunken apprentice. Luck was for the gullible, the god-smote, the guileless. It was not luck that the newly extracted ghost went flying in the direction of the gorse bush, more particularly toward a small silvery-brown pot-bellied missel thrush in the gorse bush, a missel thrush who, beneath the thick concealment of the yellow-laden branches, was industriously slamming a snail into a pebble to get at the meat. Not lucky at all. It was will. It was want. It was aim. With purpose had the ghost been driving his host body. Ooh, I'm supposed to Zoom with my brothers in 5 minutes, but that's not happening. With purpose had the ghost been driving his host body through Damarash, making for the uplands of Leech, where the monstrous skin changers dwelt under the unholy protection of the witch queen. At this moment of need, any skin changer would do. All right, so he's jumping into the skin changer. It's terrible, and he wrestles the body. He wrestles the body for ascendancy, and the skin changer's like, what the fuck? And he finally gets it, and he's changing his body into something. Laney's companion, who's in the shape of a hawk, is trying to get him. So he needs something that will fight the hawk. Something cunning, something agile, something that ate pesky birds for a living. Just as the kestrel descended, a catamount exploded from the feathers of the missile thrush. It rounded on the raptor midair and swiped at her with its claw. The kestrel veered at the last second, bolted higher. The catamount leapt after her, missed, twisted, and landed on all four paws. It turned to face the deer. The deer's fog-filled eyes locked with the catamount's glowing blue one. "Hello, girlie," said the ghost of a radiant stone to his great-granddaughter. "Missed me, did you?" Then the catamount pounced and tore the little deer's rotting head from its spine. Smoky antlers, silver fangs, and fog-filled eyes vanished. The deer collapsed, its undeath undone. The necromancer Miscellaneous Stones opened her eyes and shouted, "Fuck!" All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so yeah, it's going to be out, they say the spring of 2025. It's due at the end of October. It is not done yet. We will just see how this goes. But the first one is available right now.
Thank you. So there are books to be had, and Claire and Steve will sign them for you. Have another drink, hang out, and come back next month.
You have been listening to the Fantastic Fiction at KGB reading series. Check out our website at kgbfantasticfiction.org and click on support if you'd like to help keep the series going. Anyway, that's our show. Thanks for listening and see you next month.